Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Whitehill. There are many commercial real estate sectors: large apartments, office, hotel, hospitality, retail, warehouse, industrial. Well, what's thriving? What's been beaten up so bad and is never coming back? And what's in a dip that's ripe for opportunity? Also, creative deal structuring. If you don't have a lot of money, it's the debut of the king of commercial real estate here today on Get Rich Education. When you want the best real estate and finance info, the modern internet experience limits your free articles access, and it's replete with paywalls, and you've got pop-ups and push notifications and cookies disclaimers. Ugh. At no other time in history has it been more vital to place nice, clean, free content into your hands that actually adds no hype value to your life. See, this is the golden age of quality newsletters, and I write every word of ours myself. It's got a dash of humor, and it's to the point. To get the letter, it couldn't be more simple. Text GRE to 66866. And when you start the free newsletter, you'll also get my 1-hour fast real estate course completely free. It's called the Don't Quit Your Daydream letter, and it wires your mind for wealth. Make sure you read it. Text GRE to 66866. Text GRE to 66866.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Tuscarora, Pennsylvania to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Whitehill, and you're listening to Get Rich Education. Today's guest, the king of commercial real estate, is talented, dynamic, global, articulate, has both a wide range of knowledge and an expansive palette of creative strategies in both commercial and residential, where you can buy with little out of pocket. And he's going to share that with us today. That's coming up here shortly. Now, when we think about residential real estate, of course, that is a really wide world in itself, from condos to single-family homes to tiny studio apartments. You could also divide it into short-term and mid-term and long-term rentals, and then you could also parse it by all of the geographic markets. Well, of course, the commercial real estate world has a ton of segments too, one of which is office, which I want to talk about because it's probably been the most downtrodden and beleaguered since 2020, but there are still some things that are misunderstood within office. And even dividing things up that much, let's take care not to broad brushstroke office real estate itself. Some smaller segments of office might be in decent shape today. Other office segments are in real trouble. Like, we're talking about tall concrete and glass office towers, and a lot of business parks too. Yeah, business parks, sort of campus-like areas, like maybe what the comedy The Office had. Yeah, Dunder Mifflin was in a business park.
I'm just helping you invest in your future, my friend.
It sounds like a get-rich-quick scheme.
Yes, thank you. You will get rich quick. We all will.
Yeah, I guess that's what Steve Carell's character, Michael Scott from The Office, says about prudent investing. Let's talk about office real estate and how that intersects with the housing market. And really, a lot of this comes down to the office vacancy rate. Moody's tells us that 1 in 5 office spaces in this economy are empty, and that is the highest ever, and a lot of people think that it's going to go higher. Right now, Dayton, Ohio's is the highest in the nation at 28%. These are office vacancy rates. Charleston, West Virginia is 27%, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 26%, and Houston, Dallas, and Austin are all in the top 10 for the worst office vacancy rates. Now, a lot of city officials, they want to turn that into housing, and they want government funding in order to make that transition happen from office to residential. This is most attractive to cities if you can partially convert a building to have housing on upper floors, and then you just maintain some offices on lower floors. And see that mix right there. That makes for a vibrant, lively downtown community, because that way you don't have downtowns that go quiet at 5 o'clock. But a lot of these renovations, they just aren't that feasible. They call them resi conversions. That's kind of what this is known as. So office to residential, I mean, that means you often got to deal with huge floor plates, overhaul mechanical systems, and you've even got to consider things like the fact that windows don't open in office buildings, and they've often got to for resi conversions. Well, with this prolonged high vacancy in offices, well, where do these people that would have been in offices spend their time instead? Well, of course, at home in their residential real estate. And oftentimes it is a 1-for-1. You have one less person occupying an office for lots of that waking day, and that means one more person occupying their home. Well, that's one reason that people are increasingly willing to spend and pay more for homes, because they're spending more time than ever there. And ever since the work from home movement and Zoom from home movement, if you will, since that became commonplace for urban workers coming out the pandemic, you soon saw the hashtag RTO, the return to office movement. That began as where you've got to come into the office 2 to 3 days a week. And then a lot of companies tried to ramp it up to 4 to 5 days per week. Some companies even said, yeah, come on in here. You've got to in order to be eligible for promotions. Well, a lot of people don't want to come into the office. We found that out now, especially younger workers. In fact, did you ever hear of the term coffee badging? Yes, some workers are trying to game the system. Coffee badging, that is the art of returning to the office to a quick hit. Just have a quick hit. You only badge in, get coffee, chat, and peace out of there. Well, more people are doing this, or they're staying at home, than what you're often led to believe. So despite the RTO movement that you hear about, the share of employed persons that work their average day from home, last year, it rose to 35%, up from 34%, and that's per the BLS. Well, that's a little interesting to know, but it all comes down to that office vacancy rate, which is, like I said, a stubbornly high, all-time record, 20% nationally, and it could go higher. If you're going to invest in office real estate today, I mean, you've really got to have some insider knowledge and invest smart.
Did you use the word smart? So you said you went to Delaware State, but you forgot the name of your college. You didn't go to Delaware State. You graduated either the lowest or almost the lowest in your class. Don't ever use the word smart with me. Don't ever use that word.
Oh, give me a break.
Because you know what? There's nothing smart about you, Joe.
Oh, dear. Oh, one of those two men is our current president, and the other could be our next president. Well, love him or hate him, I guess the Trump, hey, he is the Art of the Deal author. And when you think about the Trump name, you sure think about seeing those letters on tall office buildings and hotels. Coming up on the show here in future weeks, we are stacked with great guests: an NFL All-Pro, the president of the Mises Institute, the return of the tax-free wealth author Tom Wheelwright, and also the incomparable financial firepower of Garrett Gunderson. That's all coming up here in future shows. Let's talk to the king of commercial real estate. This week's guest is a former high-tech engineer turned real estate mogul and New York Times best-selling author of the book Real Estate Riches. He is globally renowned for his ginormous real estate ventures and his mentorship, but his approach to real estate isn't just transactional. It's about strategic creativity and leveraging property investment for financial independence, known as the king of commercial real estate. Hey, welcome here for your GRE debut. Joining us from Malta today, it's Dolf de Roos.
Thank you very much. It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's great to finally speak here on the show. And I know that a good segment of our international audience has been anticipating this episode. And Dolph, when we think about commercial real estate today, problems come to mind immediately, like the large apartment space with interest rates blowing things up over there, and then the office sector, which just seems to be dying and never coming back. So first of all, why don't you give us an overview on how various commercial sectors are doing today?
There's always the things that you see on the surface, what you read in the newspapers and what you lead yourself to believe just on the sheer balance of probability. And then there's the reality of what is truly going on. And I'm always amused at the chasm between them. There's a big difference. And in fact, your ability to do well in real estate is largely dependent on the arbitrage between the market's perception of where things are at and the reality. Now, if we all follow the trends, real estate doesn't go up linearly, as mathematicians would say. It goes up in fits and starts, with each peak a bit higher than the previous peak and each trough a bit higher than the previous trough. But in addition to that, real estate markets always overshoot. So that when things are going well, when the public perception is that things are going well, interest rates are low, there's good capital growth, people think it's going to go on forever, it will never end, and they pay way too much for properties. We have the greater fool theory, where no matter how big a fool you are to pay too much for a property, it doesn't matter, because next year there'll be an even bigger fool to pay even more for it.
Right.
So everyone jumps into the market, overshoots, and then there's a strong correction, a bit like the 2008 GFC. It was on the cards, the writing was on the wall, as they say, and then it corrects. But instead of correcting back to where it should be, it overshoots on the downside as well. And in Phoenix, where I'm based, at one stage we had 90,000 homes into foreclosure simultaneously, and they were selling them on the courthouse steps at the rate of one every 56 seconds.
Gosh.
For initially 20,000, 25,000, and people thought, why are these fools buying these properties? The market's crashed. It will never recover. And yet, when you live long enough, which unfortunately I have to say I've done now, I've been around a while, I've seen a few cycles. No, I'm serious though, Keith, because when you experience your first downturn, you think it's the end of the world. But when you've been through three and you've seen that despite all the bad press and saying it's doomsday, it will never recover, it not only recovers, but it actually far exceeds where it was before it crashed last time, then you know that the time to take action is when everyone else is panicking. You have to be counter-cyclical. When everyone else is jumping on this bandwagon and paying too much for properties, that's when you should get on a plane and read some good books on a beach somewhere, preferably in a foreign location. Why a foreign location? I'm being disloyal to the home country? No, just explore something, expand your mind. And, I know I'm waving around a bit from topic to topic, but one of the great things about reading books on foreign beaches is that you get to see different ideas of real estate that you can bring back home. So when you bring back these ideas that can help correct the market, then you don't wish for a crash, but you think when it happens, well, there's got to be some good aspect to this, and you can actually find some stunning deals from people who are too scared to think it might recover.
Well, some of those places where you might find stunning deals are in some of those commercial real estate sectors that are suffering today. Tell us a bit more about some of those sectors in their health. We're talking about 5+ unit apartments, office, hotel, hospitality, retail, warehouse, industrial. Let us know what's going on with some of those sectors.
Okay, well, they're all in a state of flux, and it's a very good question. Let's talk about hotels for a moment. When the pandemic set in, we were all told to do this thing called to be socially distant. We've almost blissfully forgotten that expression, but social distancing was the thing. So hotels fell out of favor because you're in a foyer with a concierge and a reception area and hundreds of other hotel guests checking in and checking out. So Airbnbs became very popular, and the value of hotels plummeted. Many couldn't meet their mortgage obligations because their revenue from room sales did not cover their own loan commitments. So they were being sold off at ridiculously cheap prices. I know of one hotel in the Atlanta area, admittedly it was a very old hotel. It was converted into a storage facility. When you think about it, hotels are all compartmentalized and they have good little cubicles for storage.
Yeah.
And Airbnbs took off, and we all know people, and people wrote books about it and had courses on it. I know in Phoenix, one statistic in a 12-month period from July 22 to July 23, the availability of Airbnbs went up by 23%. And all would have been good and well if demand had kept on escalating. But as the pandemic sort of wound down, and people realized they didn't need to be socially distant anymore. And what's more, when you went to an Airbnb, what you found is that there was a long laundry list of items you had to do. Put the sheets through the washing machine, no more than one bed at a time. Well, 4 beds worth of sheets is going to take you 3 hours. And do this and do that. People thought hotels are much easier. So there was a massive swing by tenants of rooms back to hotels, and the value of hotels went back up. And in the meantime, the value of houses used as Airbnbs, it sort of peaked a bit and it's going down rapidly. How far it will go down, I'm not so sure. So my point is, with hotels, in a very short period of time, like 3 years, the values plummeted and then they came back up again. Office space is suffering a bit of a longer cycle downturn. It's fair to say, I think, that offices are in a very dire strait. There's something like $785 billion of mortgages secured against commercial office space that is coming up for renewal, and there's not enough revenue to cover them. There is a pair of hotels on Union Square in San Francisco, for instance, the Park Renaissance and the Renaissance itself. They had $745 million of mortgage funding, and the operators of those hotels handed the keys back to the bank and said, we can't make this cash flow. There's a lot of commercial space that is being sold off at ridiculously cheap prices. So there are 2 ways of looking at this, Keith. One is, if you happen to own office space right now, unless it's boutique space, I've got quite a bit of office space, but it's very much a boutique classification, and there'll always be demand for boutique office space from unique operators like interior decorators and people like that. But for the general concrete and glass office towers, demand for that has plummeted. The values have gone down, and I know of one building in Chicago, it's sold for $315 million. It's on the market at 60 and dropping, and there's not a buyer in sight. And you might say, well, it's got to be a bargain. But no, here's the challenge with commercial real estate, unlike residential. Residential is valued on the basis of comps. We all know that. If you have a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home, certain age, certain size, certain condition, in a certain suburb, then, and if it's sold for, say, $480,000, then a similar sized and aged house up the road, down the street, around the corner is going to sell for about the same amount. Whether it's tenanted or not, that doesn't even matter. But when it comes to commercial real estate, the value of a commercial property is literally a multiple of its rental income. Technically, it's the rental income divided by the cap rate, where cap rate is short for capitalization rate. It literally means the rate at which you capitalize the rental to arrive at the value. So if we can figure out a way of doubling the rental, then we've doubled the value. And by the same token, of course, if you lose a tenant and you have your rental, then you have the value. And that's why the value of so many of these commercial office buildings has plummeted, because there are no tenants for them.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. And back to the Airbnb thing, yeah, about 2 years ago, there seemed to be this well-documented Airbnb bust. And my gosh, I personally had awful Airbnb experiences recently, including checking into an Airbnb where it hadn't been turned over. It hadn't been cleaned yet. And then I could never unsee what I saw. Then I had to stay there. Right. That was really rough. I think what you're getting at here is once you hit a bottom, that's where the opportunity is. So there are going to be some of those opportunities somewhere in the commercial real estate sector. Commercial real estate syndicators, many of them imploded from high rates. So when we talk about finding the bottom, like with these large apartment buildings, how many more apartment syndicator implosions do we expect from the higher mortgage rates?
Many. I'm indifferent to it. I'm not saying I don't have sympathy for the people who own them, and I'm not gleeful for those who buy a bargain, but here's why I'm indifferent. I think it's fair to say that I've made most of my money in real estate by finding either vacant or semi-vacant buildings. And that goes against the grain, Keith. Most people think they need to look for a building with a good tenant because it's the tenant that pays the rent. And that's not incorrect. That's accurate. And then if you've got a building that you buy at, say, 8% return and your mortgage interest is 7%, hopefully that 1% margin covers your property taxes and your insurance and your maintenance. And then you just wait for time to do its thing, where slowly over time the rents creep up and the property value creeps up. I don't have the luxury of waiting that long, and I never had the cash to buy properties like that. So I literally sought out semi-vacant or even vacant buildings. Now, I didn't buy them because if I bought a vacant building, I still have to pay property tax and insurance. But what I would do before buying it is see if I can find a tenant. And I can give you a specific example. I came across a vacant building that was a funeral parlor. And most people don't like to think of what goes on in a funeral parlor, but they have these stainless steel trays where they put the product of their business on, and they insert these hollow stainless steel tubes and suck out the blood and replace it with formaldehyde and all kinds of things we don't want to think about.
That's even worse than my Airbnb experience.
No one knew what to do with it. So I found it, and it was being sold for a song because it was vacant. And what I did is I employed someone at the then going hourly rate of $8 an hour to phone every funeral director going further and further from this place until she found someone who said, oh my gosh, I've always wanted to operate there. And I was just open and honest, and I said, well, there's a funeral parlor premise for sale. Go and check it out. If you want to buy it, buy it. Why would I offer it to him, Keith, when I really wanted to buy it? Because the last thing I want is a tenant who begrudges the fact that the only reason he's paying me rent is that I beat him to it. But I knew that in all probability he didn't want to buy real estate. That's not his gig. And he said, no, I don't have the money or the inclination. He had a look at it. He said, listen, I love it. I want to operate there. What would it take? And I said, well, if you're willing to sign up a heads of agreement, an LOI, where subject to me buying it, you will become the tenant, then I'll have a crack at buying it. And his response was, well, not so fast, Sonny Jim. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. Well, that's exactly what I want. So I'd found a tenant. By adding the tenant to this otherwise vacant building, the value of it doubled. And when I went to the bank to apply for a mortgage, they said, well, we're only going to give you 50%. Well, guess what? 50% of double the value was the purchase price. They lent me all but the last $10,000 to buy that property. So the magic source here is finding the tenant. Could anyone else have gone through at the time, this is before the internet, the yellow pages, and phoned every funeral director going further? Of course they could, but no one thought of doing it. And that comes to part of what you had in your title, that this is all about creative real estate. The thing I love about real estate is it's about the only investment vehicle where you can actually use your creativity. I mean, if you're a really creative person and you buy a portfolio of stock, IBM stock and Microsoft and biotech, what
can you do to improve it?
How can you deploy your creativity?
Yeah.
How can you deploy what you've seen in your travels to make your stock portfolio worth more? Zero. Absolutely nothing. Not with stocks, not with bonds, not with futures, options, certificates of deposits, treasury bills, nothing. But with real estate, the sky's the limit. I love that.
Well, you talked about getting into commercial real estate sectors with little or none of your own money. That's part of the creativity. A lot of our audience is interested in investing in residential property. A single-family home, you might still be able to get one for $150K. Now, 20 to 25% down payment on that, $30K plus. I mean, that's still pretty manageable for a lot of people, but many are somewhat intimidated by commercial real estate. I think one of the first things they think about is, how do I come up with the money? So we talk about creativity in funding that down payment. Tell us more about some good strategies for doing that and kind of overcoming that daunting feeling of higher commercial real estate prices.
You're absolutely right. Most people think commercial real estate is more expensive, where you might be able to buy a home in a cheaper market, a cheaper price point at $120,000. Say a commercial property is going to be $500,000, or if homes are $1 million in a fancy suburb, then the commercial properties are $3 million. That's true, but not all properties are like that. My smallest commercial building was a little corner shop. It was a wet fish supply shop. So they sold fish there, but not cooked fish. And it was a horrible looking thing. But I paid all of $79,000 for it, and it's been rented on a full commercial lease from the day I bought it. So it needn't be large. In fact, we tend to only notice the big ones with a for sale sign. You're in the downtown of some city, and you see one of the big firms, CB Richard Ellis or Jones Lang LaSalle or something, for lease or for sale sign.
Fair enough.
Well, that's actual. And you don't tend to notice the small ones. The trick in finding good value real estate, be it commercial or residential, again, has to do with the fact that it's not an automated market like the stock market. You buy stock, it's through computers on a share market. Everyone pays the same price. But when it comes to real estate, the seller may choose to go through a real estate agency. It might be a national one, and then it's vetted by many agents. But we have a thing known as FSBOs, or for sale by owner. And why would a seller choose to circumvent a real estate agent? Well, probably because he's hoping to save on the 6% commission. By the way, that's the highest in the world. And the rest of the world is 2 or 1.5 or 3%. It's soon to be lowered in the States. But even so, they want to save on that commission. And more sinisterly, perhaps some of them think, Why should I entrust my property, the sale of my property, to some snooty-nosed 22-year-old kid just out of school who doesn't even live in the suburb? I have lived here for 59 years or whatever he says, and I know what it's worth. And in pricing it, he's either way too high or way too low. Now, if he's way too high, you and I aren't going to buy it because it's just way too high. We know that. But what if it's 100,000 below market value? It happens every day of the week. And if we stumble across one of those, then we might just make 100,000 that day. Not in terms of cash, not in terms of folding hard cash, but in terms of equity. And we could sell it the next day for 100,000 more, but we don't because we want to invest in it. And these things are real, Keith. These happen. That's why I encourage people, don't take the same route home from work every day. If you've finished work, get in your car, take a different route home. Keep your eyes peeled. Look for FSBO signs or for sale by owner, or look for abandoned properties, ones where the grass is a bit high and there's litter blown up against the fence and the windows are a bit grimy. And then do some research to find out who owns it.
Sometimes the greater the crisis, the greater the opportunity. But Dolf, when we talk about, say, if one has overcome the money and the down payment thing, in effect, when we go ahead and get a loan, whatever sector we're investing in, the bank underwrites either us or the bank underwrites the property. But in a sense, us as the investor we're sort of underwriting the tenant that's in there. Now, when we buy a residential building, we can look at the tenant's credit scores and their work history. And, we know that the residential tenant is going to pay us to live there. We have a good sense of faith about that. But when it comes to commercial real estate investing, say I want to buy a plaza with 8 businesses in it, I think a lot of investors feel overwhelmed because they're like, oh my gosh, how do I study the validity of these 8 businesses? And how do I know that they're going to be solvent and sustainable going forward? And do I need to understand all this? Or can you speak to that and help break that down for us a bit? Basically, the investor underwriting the tenant.
That's all true, and yet there isn't that much to learn, because if we take your imaginary shopping plaza with 8 tenants, I think we'd all agree that if one of those tenants was a Gloria Bean Coffee and Tea or whatever it's called, or Seattle's Best, or Pete's Coffee, not to mention Starbucks, that's a global chain now, but one of those lesser brands, I think we would be pretty comfortable that they can pay the rent every month. And similarly, the bank underwriting that loan would think, wow, a Pete's Coffee or Gloria, they're a good tenant. And, just to name others at random, Ross Dress for Less, that's a nationwide chain store. I think if we had them as a tenant, that would augur well. And you might get a couple of independents, but they would have a track record. They've leased those same premises for the previous 8 years, and they moved there from other premises which ended up being too small for them. That means they're expanding, where they were for 12 years. Things like that give a picture to any novice in this game to say, wow, they're probably going to be here for the long haul. And beyond that, what happens when you develop the skills to attract new tenants? You don't worry about that even, because you know that when you lose a tenant, it's easy to get one. Listen, I've got 101 ways of getting tenants for buildings, and I'm blown away that people don't deploy even one of them. And I'll give you an example from last week. I was with a client in the UK, in Bournemouth, which is way in the south of the country. And we were looking at a commercial office building there, and it had been vacant for 18 months. And I said to the agent, what seems to be the trouble with getting a tenant? And he shrugged his shoulders and said, well, I don't know. It's been on the market for 18 months. And I said, has it ever occurred to you to put a sign outside the property, a big canvas sign hanging on the side of the building, signs in the grass verge saying, this building is for lease, inquire within, or go to this website? And he was stupefied by that thought. He said, what an amazingly good idea. You have to let people know. They think that they're going to go to their office because they're looking for office space. So now, would I be guaranteed to get a tenant within a week by putting a canvas sign on the building? Of course not. But I know we won't reduce the chances. And that's why if I can find a tenant before committing to buy the building, I'm pretty confident we'll get there. And I've got all these other techniques, Keith, of doing it. Like one that I really love is, let's say you've got a vacant warehouse, and it's an ugly, horrible warehouse in a sea of similarly ugly and vacant warehouses. If you and I bought that, I would hazard to suggest that we would have a tenant within a month. And here's how we'd do it. We would spend no more than $10,000, and we would go to the manager's office, because ultimately the person who decides whether to lease our warehouse as opposed to another one is not the CEO in the head office in New York or LA or wherever. It's not the cleaning lady or man who's going to sweep the floor. it's going to be the manager who's going to manage it. So I get rid of the linoleum and I put in commercial grade carpet. I put in triple glazed or dual glazed windows, keeps the noise out and the warmth in. I replace the fluorescent tubes with LED lights. I replace the locks with electronic locks so he can never forget his keys. I put in an 80-inch LCD screen and tell him it's good for corporate training videos. And we know he's never going to watch corporate training videos on it. But those TVs you can buy for $500 now. I put in a little coffee machine and make sure it's brewing when he looks, and I have a fridge for end-of-week drink celebrations. And our unsuspecting manager, who's looked at 7 ugly warehouses so far that day, when he comes to our ugly warehouse and he opens that door to the manager's office, subconsciously or maybe consciously, he thinks, oh my gosh, if I lease this one, this is where I'm going to be parked for 40 hours a week for Lord knows how many years. He says, I'll take it. And he hasn't even asked the rental. You might say that's bribery and corruption, but I think it's just offering a better product than the competition. No one else does this.
Oh, well, this is another brilliant example of using creativity in real estate investing. We're talking with the king of commercial real estate, Dolf de Roos. More when we come back, including some of his psychology and insights from the rich. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Whitehill. Hey, you can get your mortgage loans at the same place where I get mine, at Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They've provided our listeners with more loans than any provider in the entire nation because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. You can start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. Start now while it's on your mind at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com. Your bank is getting rich off of you. The national average bank account pays less than 1% on your savings. If your money isn't making 4%, you're losing your hard-earned cash to inflation. Let the liquidity fund help you put your money to work with minimum risk. Your cash generates up to an 8% return with compound interest year in and year out instead of earning less than 1% sitting in your bank account. The minimum investment is just $25K. You keep getting paid until you decide you want your money back. Their decade-plus track record proves they've always paid their investors 100% in full and on time. And I would know because I'm an investor too. Earn 8%, hundreds of others are. Text FAMILY to 66866. Learn more about Freedom Family Investments Liquidity Fund on your journey to financial freedom through passive income. Text FAMILY to 66866.
What's up, everyone? This is HGTV's Tarek El Moussa. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and Don't Quit Your Daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. You're listening to episode 513 of the show that's created more passive income for busy people just like you than nearly any show in the world. I'm your host, Keith Whitehill. We're with the king of commercial real estate, Dolf de Roos. Just like he has a lot of creative, proven types of things that you can do to improve commercial real estate, he also has a lot of those ideas for residential because he's been around the game for so long. So Dolf, tell us about some more of those creative ways to add value to residential real estate.
Well, probably like most people who end up focusing on commercial real estate, I got started in residential, and that's where I first deployed some of my creativity. And I noticed, for instance, that I'd have a rental property that had no garage and no carport. And when you think about it, a tenant's biggest asset, because it's not their home, it tends to be their car. One could argue that because they waste money on expensive cars every 2 years, that's why they can't afford to buy a home, but we won't go there. So if it's their car, if there's no carport and no garage, that means their biggest asset is in the rain, the sleet, the sun, the shine, the hail, you name it. So by building a carport, we can protect their biggest asset. And it's worth a lot more to them. By any means, if you have a carport on a house, that house will rent for about $80 a month extra. And 80 a month times 12 is $960. Call it $1,000 extra a rent in year. And Keith, I can build a carport for $1,000 easily. It's simply 4 posts, 1 in each corner, and then a roof with a bit of a slope. Why the slope? Well, if it rains, the rain falls off. If you're really cheap, you can get away with 3 posts. It still stands, But no, and I'm being silly, but we sometimes make them with 2 posts and cantilever them. They're a bit more expensive, but then there are no posts out front. So I can build a carport for $1,000, and then I get $1,000 extra a year coming in. And when you think about it, again, which other investment can you think of that once you've consummated the deal, once you own it, you can spend an extra $1,000 and then get 100% return on that money? And as they say in the infomercials, but wait, it gets even better. Because think about it. Let's say we have that carport built, but we haven't paid for it yet. And so we've got our $1,000 a year extra of rental coming in. We go back to the appraiser and say we want a new appraisal. With an extra $1,000 coming in, he's likely to appraise it at $10,000 more. With that increased appraisal of $10,000, we go back to the bank and say, Mr. Bank Manager, remember I got a 70 or 80% more. I've now got an appraisal for $10,000 more. Will you give me a modest 70% loan on that? Well, banks are in the game of lending money and making a profit, so they say yes. So you get $7,000 from the bank. Let's use $1,000 of that $7,000 to pay for the carport. It's now paid for. That leaves us with $6,000 cash. And the question is it earned income? And the answer is no, it's not earned income. There's no income tax on it. Is it the sale of something? No, didn't sell it. No sales tax, no capital gains. It's tax-free money. And you might say, but hang on, you've now borrowed $7,000 that you have to pay interest on. Even at a ridiculously high 10%, that would only cost $700 a year, but we're collecting an extra $1,000 a year. So when you build this carport, you have 2 choices. One is pay cash for it and get 100% return on your money. Or the second one is don't pay any money for it. Put $6,000 of tax-free money in your pocket and get $300 a year surplus cash flow indexed for inflation for the rest of your life. Like, why would you not do that?
Well, and it's a terrific example of how to actionably improve the property. And it's so interesting that you bring this up, Dolf, because just a few weeks ago here on the show, I talked about garage real estate. I mentioned how adding a carport can often be more cost-effective for a landlord from an ROI standpoint than constructing a garage. And I also talked about the future, and with autonomous cars, people are going to need garages as much as they will, but that's into the future, and that's another subject in itself. Dolf, for one really important thing, I know that probably even more important than the actionable investing is getting people in the right mindset to do this in the first place. You've studied this in really unexpected psychology behind wealth creation. And Dolf, I think a lot of it is counterintuitive, but it kind of makes sense because if you come from a scarcity and conventional mindset and you just do mediocre stuff, you're only going to get a mediocre outcome. So why don't you talk to us more about breaking down that psychology that most Americans and most residents of everywhere in the world really struggle with?
Well, my pleasure. I had been teaching real estate for about 15 years, and I decided, why I don't know, but I decided to run a survey to find out how many of my students became a millionaire within 18 months. That was my expected time frame of reasonableness.
And is that when a millionaire was actually wealthy?
Right. And I was pretty confident, but when the results came in, I was devastated because it was fewer than 4%. And in my mind, 4% wasn't even statistically significant. Meaning if you take 1,000 people at random, 4% are going to become millionaires. One's going to marry into money, one's going to win the lottery, one's going to win at a casino, and the fourth one's going to fall over a paper bag and looks inside, and would you believe it, there's $1 million there. So I vowed to stop teaching until I'd cracked the nut, because my dilemma was, how is it that when you give people all the tools you think they need to become fabulously wealthy, they still don't do it?
Right.
And what I found is that it had nothing to do with my rate of speech or my accent, not that I have one, of course, or the content of my information or the sequencing of it. It had everything to do with the subconscious mind of the student.
The fear?
And here's how it starts. You're a young kid and you say, hey, mom or dad, I want a bicycle. And they say, well, what do you think, kiddo, that money grows on trees? And I know where the parents coming from. Hey, money's not that easy to come by. Temper your expectations of what you'll get for your bit. But this kid is, money doesn't grow on trees, meaning money's hard to come by. And how often haven't we been taught money can't buy your happiness? And money is the root of all evil. And when I say that, someone always points out, no, the full saying in the Bible is for the love of money is the root of all evil. And there's a big difference. And I'll say, yes, there is a big difference. But to the subconscious mind, it still hears money and evil in the same sentence, and it subconsciously makes that association. And the religious even say that it is easier to get a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. In other words, if you're rich, you're condemned to hell. And that's a nice, strong belief system to take on board, even subconsciously. And by the way, most people don't know what the eye of the needle is. The eye of the needle was the entrance to East Jerusalem. And even camels, and I've been there, I've sat there, camels had to get down on their knees as a sign of respect before they could enter. So there's a reason behind all these things, but the subconscious mind takes aboard, money can't buy you happiness, money's hard to come by, if you don't work hard for it, you don't deserve it, money's the root of evil, you won't get to heaven, you're condemned to hell. And how do we describe the rich, Keith? We say they're so rich, they're filthy rich. They're so rich, they're stinking rich. We associate being rich with filth and stench. So that is why in the United States and every Western nation, when someone wins the lottery, and we no longer win $10,000 or $20,000, it's 300 million or 800 million or 1.2 billion. When people win the lottery, within 5 years of winning, 80% of the winners are back to where they were before they won.
Right.
And why is that? I discovered that it's because subconsciously, even though they're happy they won it and they're going to tell their boss they're going to quit and they're going to buy their parents a nice home and they're going to get a new car, but subconsciously they feel they don't deserve it because they haven't worked hard for it. They're not going to be happy. They're now evil people. They're not going to go to heaven, and they're filthy and they stink. And the only way to overcome that is to get rid of the source of the problem, which is the money. And you'll see it happen again and again and again. So what we do is we dissolve what's in the subconscious mind, all these things that we've been saying without realizing it over and over and over again, and replace them with more empowering beliefs. And the great thing about the subconscious mind is initially you don't even have to believe the thing that you're going to say over and over again to replace those old ones. But it could be something as simple as money is good, or a bit more sophisticated, my poverty helps no one, but my wealth can help a lot of people.
The more you have, the more you can give.
Exactly. As the Reverend Ike says, I'm a magnet for money. And so when we get into this mode of thinking differently, then all of a sudden people find that the money starts flowing. And we give people specific exercises to do. And you think, well, how's that going to make a difference? But it does. And so what I found when I introduced these concepts into my real estate teaching, the success went from under 4% to over 80%. If that's not evidence enough that this works, I don't know what is.
Yes, it really takes changing that mindset to break down these old stereotypes and have the confidence to say and act upon things like financially free beats debt free. But if you're raised to think that money is a scarce resource, you think that retiring debt is a good thing, or don't focus on getting your money to work for you. Focus on getting other people's money to work for you. A lot of people don't even know what that means. But yeah, it takes breaking down some of these simple things that we all began to learn when we were age 5 or something like that. Dolf, as we're winding down here, you operate globally, you play globally. That intimidates a lot of people. They don't really know how to do that, but it's giving you this wherewithal to say that real estate is the only profession that can truly be played globally. Tell us about that.
Well, when you think about it, if you study to become, say, an attorney, you can't just up and leave the US and go to Germany or Peru or Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia to practice. You've got to study their local laws and sit the bar exam. If you're a physician, you can't just go to another country and conduct frontal lobotomies on patients. You've got to study and hit the bar exam. I had a friend, he was a dermatologist, a skin doctor from Austria. He moved to Australia after 8 years of study to get his qualifications. They wouldn't accept them. He had to start all over again. And he said, that's ridiculous. And he became a farmer and was very happy doing that. But when you think about it, not only are real estate investors welcomed all over the world, but they think that you're going to bring money with you. You don't have to, of course. In fact, if you're going to invest as a U.S. citizen in another country, I would not recommend bringing U.S. dollars with you. I'd recommend borrowing locally, because if you bring U.S. dollars with you, then you're subject to exchange rate fluctuations. So just borrow locally, and then you've got no risk from that at all. But despite the fact, the other countries, the host countries, think that you're an investor, you're going to bring money, so they welcome you with open arms. I think it's the only profession where you are never discriminated against, you're welcomed, you're made to feel welcome, they want more of you, they encourage you to come with delegations of other investors. It's kind of a good gig to be on.
Make the world yours. The UN recognizes 193 world nations. Get out and see them and invest outside your own home country if you have the ability to. Well, Dolf, you've got this interesting combination of commercial real estate focus, a great grasp of the mindset and how to help people with the wealth mindset. And then thirdly, you also operate globally. So it's been really interesting to speak with you. You help people in so many ways with a lot of your teaching resources. So why don't you let our audience know how they can engage with that?
We have a lot of programs that we run from time to time. I mentioned I saw a client in the UK. He was an example of someone we did a flyout for. I'd spend 3 days just with that one client to help him with his portfolio. But the thing I've got coming up is a live training, and people can get a free seat to attend and learn more at my website called Dolf Live. So Dolf, my name, DOLF, and then live, LIVE.com. DolfLive.com. You can see what we've got coming up there. It's entirely free to attend. And then, once that event's gone, I'm sure we'll post other things there. But that's the best way of staying informed with what I've got going. Part of my passion, Keith, is sharing it. It's pretty boring doing it on your own. And one of the biggest thrills I get is when you get feedback by email or however from someone who said, well, when I heard this or saw that or read this, I wasn't even sure if it would work. And I certainly wasn't sure if it would work for me. But look at what I've done since then. And that gives you a feeling that you can't describe in words. That's pretty cool. You change someone's life and you don't even really know who they are. So that's fun.
Dolf de Roos, it's been helpful to me and our audience today, the king of commercial real estate. Thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Check out dolflive.com. It looks like he's got a live event coming up this Thursday night. And if you missed that, more afterward. Like I was saying earlier, a ton of great episodes coming up here on the Get Rich Education podcast, just stacked. As always, you'll get lessons from me when I'm going to break down, is any debt worth paying off? Which debts are, which are not, and why? That's going to help you know what to do with every debt for the rest of your life. And that's besides what I mentioned earlier, both new guests and very popular returning guests. I hope that you learned something today. I'll run it back next week when we meet again. Until then, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.